Imagine a world without devices like computers, mobile phones, or television. Sounds impossible, right? Well, that's the world without semiconductors. Today we're going to dip our toes into the fascinating world of semiconductors. These tiny components are the unsung heroes of modern technology, and they're all around us. They're in our phones, our laptops, our cars, and even our kitchen appliances. If a device uses electricity, it likely uses semiconductors. So what exactly are semiconductors? At their core, semiconductors are materials that have a unique ability. They can act as an insulator, blocking the flow of electricity, or as a conductor, allowing electricity to flow. This functionality is why they are called semiconductors. They're like the switchboard operators of the electronic world, directing traffic and making sure everything runs smoothly. Semiconductors come in two main types, intrinsic and extrinsic. Intrinsic semiconductors are pure, with no impurities added. They're a bit like the flour in a cake recipe, necessary, but on their own they don't have much flavor. On the other hand, extrinsic semiconductors are like a cake that's been jazzed up with some extra ingredients. They have impurities added to them, which changes their properties and makes them more useful for certain applications. These impurities can make the semiconductor more positively charged, which we call p-type, or more negatively charged, which we call n-type. But why does this matter? Well, by knowing how to manipulate semiconductors, we can create all sorts of incredible technology. From computer processors to solar panels, the applications of semiconductors are practically endless. Now that you know the basics, delve deeper to understand intrinsic semiconductors. Because as we peel back the layers of this topic, you'll discover that the world of semiconductors is as complex and intriguing as it is integral to our modern lives. Buckle up, because we're just getting started. Scene script. Picture a pure silicon crystal. This is what we call an intrinsic semiconductor. Now, what exactly is an intrinsic semiconductor? Good question. Intrinsic semiconductors are made from a single type of material, like our friend silicon here. These are pure semiconductors with no impurities added to change their properties. Intrinsic semiconductors have a fascinating feature. They are perfectly balanced in terms of their charge carriers. What does that mean? Well, in every intrinsic semiconductor, there's an equal number of free electrons and holes. Free electrons are the negatively charged particles that can move around. Holes, on the other hand, are the vacancies left behind when an electron gets enough energy to jump from its place. These holes are considered as positively charged. Let's get into a bit more detail. Silicon, for instance, has a unique structure. Each silicon atom is bonded to 4 other silicon atoms in a crystal lattice structure. This setup allows each atom to share its 4 outermost electrons, also known as valence electrons, with its neighbors. This sharing of electrons creates a stable structure with no free electrons at absolute zero temperature. But when we heat this silicon crystal or provide some energy, things change. Some electrons gain enough energy to jump from their place, leaving behind a hole. These energetic electrons are now free to move, and the holes they left behind can also accept other electrons. Hence, we have both electrons and holes acting as charge carriers. What's fascinating is that the number of free electrons equals the number of holes in an intrinsic semiconductor. This equal number ensures that the semiconductor remains electrically neutral, even though there's a lot of activity happening within. So that's your intrinsic semiconductor. But what happens when we add impurities? That's where extrinsic semiconductors come into play. Think of a pinch of salt added to a glass of water. That's similar to how we create extrinsic semiconductors. Just as the salt changes the properties of the water, introducing impurities to a semiconductor alters its properties, leading to the creation of what we call an extrinsic semiconductor. In the simplest terms, extrinsic semiconductors are semiconductors that have been doped. That is, impurities have been added intentionally to change their electrical properties. This process of doping is akin to adding that pinch of salt to our glass of water. Now, let's delve a bit deeper into this. Our semiconductor, to begin with, is neutral. It's what we call an intrinsic semiconductor. But when we introduce impurities, things change. Depending on the type of impurity we add, we can create 2 types of extrinsic semiconductors, N-type and P-type. Let's start with N-type semiconductors. And here stands for negative. In an N-type semiconductor, the impurity atoms have more valence electrons than the semiconductor atoms. When we add these impurities, these extra electrons increase the semiconductor's ability to conduct electricity. On the other hand, we have P-type semiconductors, where P stands for positive. In a p-type semiconductor, the impurity atoms have fewer valence electrons than the semiconductor atoms. Here, the absence of electrons or holes enhances the conductivity. In both n-type and p-type semiconductors, the magic lies in these extra electrons or the lack thereof. They are the ones that carry the charge and enhance the conductivity, making extrinsic semiconductors a vital element in the world of electronics. So, in a nutshell, extrinsic semiconductors are doped semiconductors. They are not pure, and that's what makes them so useful. They are intentionally contaminated with impurities to enhance their electrical properties, creating n-type and p-type semiconductors. All right, we now know what extrinsic semiconductors are, but how do they work? Let's find out. Ever seen a magnet attract a piece of iron? That's similar to how electrons move in extrinsic semiconductors. Let's dive into the fascinating world of extrinsic semiconductors and explore their unique properties. They come in two flavors, n-type and p-type semiconductors. But what does that mean? Imagine a bustling city full of activity. The vehicles zipping around represent electrons, while the parking spaces they aim to occupy represent holes. Now, in an n-type semiconductor, we have more vehicles or free electrons than parking spaces or holes. This is achieved by adding a small amount of pentavalent impurity like phosphorus to the pure semiconductor. These extra electrons are like the additional taxis in our city, ready to transport energy across the semiconductor. On the other hand, in a p-type semiconductor, we have more parking spaces or holes than vehicles or electrons. This is done by introducing a trivalent impurity such as boron to the pure semiconductor. These additional holes are like extra parking spaces in our city, waiting for an electron to fill them. In both cases, the movement of these electrons and holes is what carries the current, just like how the flow of vehicles in our city keeps the energy and life pulsing. Here's a fun fact. In n-type semiconductors, the majority charge carriers are electrons, while in p-type semiconductors, holes are the majority charge carriers. But don't be fooled. Even though they're called holes, they play a crucial role in the conduction process, acting like positive charge carriers moving in the opposite direction to the flow of electrons. Remember, understanding the working of extrinsic semiconductors is not just about knowing the difference between n-type and p-type semiconductors. It's about visualizing the movement of electrons and holes and comprehending how they work in harmony to create the flow of current. And that's how extrinsic semiconductors work. Now, are you ready to test your understanding? So, you think you've mastered semiconductors? Let's put that to the test. Let's start with a simple one. What is the main difference between intrinsic and extrinsic semiconductors? Is it the number of free electrons, the purity of the material, or the temperature at which they operate best? Moving on to the second question. Can you tell us what type of semiconductor, either n-type or p-type, is created when a trivalent impurity is added to a pure semiconductor? Think about the number of valence electrons involved and how they affect the conducting properties of the semiconductor. Now let's get a bit more technical. How does the Fermi level of an intrinsic semiconductor compare to that of an extrinsic semiconductor? Is it higher, lower, or the same? Remember, the Fermi level is a crucial concept in understanding the behavior of semiconductors. For our fourth question, can you explain why the conductivity of a semiconductor increases with temperature, unlike metals? Think about the relationship between thermal energy and the movement of charge carriers in the material. And finally, the last question. What happens to an n-type semiconductor when it is heated? Does it lose free electrons, gain free electrons, or neither? Keep in mind what you've learned about the effect of temperature on semiconductors. Take a moment to review your answers. Remember, the goal here is not just to get the right answers, but to understand the principles behind them. Semiconductors are at the heart of the devices we use every day, from our smartphones to our laptops, and understanding them is the first step towards understanding the technology that shapes our world. Well done on completing the quiz. Remember, every piece of technology you use owes its existence to semiconductors. So, keep exploring and keep learning.